Welcome to FO Talks. With me is Daniel Idfresne. He's a student at Syracuse University and a Young Voices contributor. For many of our followers who watch us from across the world, Syracuse University is in the New York State. But today we're talking about New York City, the city where Daniel has grown up in. Daniel, tell us what's going on. New York City is going to have a new mayor soon. And the current mayor, Eric Adams, is no longer part of the race. He has dropped out. Why? And what does this even mean for the other contestants?
Well, thank you for having me. As you said, I'm Daniel Idfresne. I'm a New York City native and currently a student at Syracuse University upstate. And so this election has a lot of meaning for me personally and for my family and for many other New Yorkers who live in the Big Apple. Eric Adams, as you just said, just dropped out recently. I think personally it has to do with A, the money raised, and B, the popularity or the lack thereof. At this late stage of the election, it just simply does not make sense for Eric Adams to continue. Earlier on in the election, during the Democratic primary, Eric Adams decided not to run as a Democrat. He's become a Democrat outcast, and so he decided to run independently. And many of us, and presumably Eric Adams himself too, thought that the incumbent advantage would come into play despite not being in the Democratic Party line. But we've seen the rise of Zohran Mamdani during the Democratic primary. And it seems that New Yorkers, for whatever reason, don't view Eric Adams too kindly, although he's been a perfectly mediocre mayor in many respects, notwithstanding or not even talking about some of the corruption that we've seen over the past year or so. But ultimately, Eric Adams, I think, dropped out because of money and lack of popularity. Andrew Cuomo has outperformed him when it comes to both of those metrics.
Right. So, what's happening right now? Because polls show a split. Some polls show Zohran Mamdani is in the lead. Some show that Andrew Cuomo is in the lead. And we all know that these are just opinion polls and these are not going to be the final results. So do you think Eric Adams dropping out has maybe given an advantage to either of the two candidates?
Well, I think that Eric Adams dropping out most likely gave Andrew Cuomo more of an advantage over Zohran Mamdani. After the Democratic primary, a lot of New Yorkers were awakened, especially those who are moderate and do not subscribe to the values of democratic socialism or the policy proposals of democratic socialism, which is what Zohran Mamdani self-proclaims to be. And there were three options for New Yorkers who does not describe to democratic socialism. And it was Eric Adams, Eric Adams, Andrew Cuomo, and Curtis Lewa. Now, because other New Yorkers are split between these three candidates, and there's no real reason why New Yorkers will coalesce around one other oppositional candidate to Zohran Mamdani, because if you're a Sliwa voter, chances are you will never forgive Andrew Cuomo for what happened during COVID. If you're an Andrew Cuomo voter, you perhaps have a distaste in your mouth because of Eric Adams. And if you're an Eric Adams voter, you just want the status quo to continue. And so there's no real redeeming factor, especially when there's three candidates on the ballot that would have New Yorkers coalesce around one. And so that was the operant problem that you had coming out of the Democratic primary. If you are a centrist, moderate, somebody who's conservative in New York City, but now with Eric Adams dropping out, a contingent of that anti-Mamdani voter will now go to Sliwa or Andrew Cuomo. And I think it's most likely going to be Andrew Cuomo than Curtis Lewa.
So why is Zohran Mamdani being considered as such a polarizing figure? I mean, he is making headlines. I'm sitting in India and even I know about him, his policies, his PR is really good. His pictures are often they're spread widely across not just Instagram, but X, Facebook. So there's something he has to be doing right. But why are people in New York having such a major pushback against him? But still, there is a certain section that really appreciates what he's standing up for. So, why is he considered so polarizing?
Well, you answered the question within your question in a way. First off, Zohran Mamdani has really good PR. He ran a fantastic social media campaign reaching younger voters. We've seen young New Yorkers vote at levels we haven't seen before. He's cracked a bit of that voter apathy we typically see in New York City, where low amounts of the population typically vote in mayoral elections. And that's a question for how, I would say, apathetic Americans are when it comes to municipalities or their local jurisdictions and elections. But Zohran Mamdani's social media campaign, A, and B, he's addressing a pain point with New Yorkers that is actually important nowadays. In the last election, the reason why Eric Adams won is because public safety was the first and foremost issue on New Yorkers' mind. But this time around, it's affordability. And when you couple like you said, an excellent PR campaign with easy to understand policy solutions like freezer rent, fare free busing, and city owned grocery stores, for example, it makes it very, you can gain a lot of traction from that. But as we see, as we're in October right now, Zohran Mamdani really hasn't, at least from what the polls show, hasn't cracked more and more New Yorkers. It seems that through his polling, it seems that he's reached a sort of ceiling. Many of those who voted for him in the Democratic primary, they'll show up again in November. But his favorable rating when it comes to polling hasn't really increased. If anything, his unfavorable ratings has increased, while his favorable rating stays the same. When we look at polling after polling, he stays around that high 40s mark, not really making much gain from there. And it really seems that, yes, there is a contingent of New Yorkers who agree with his messaging, but there's many more New Yorkers who may not, who knows who he is and are not buying the message. And now the big question is whether New Yorkers will remain apathetic, as they historically been, when it comes to mayoral elections, or will they coalesce around one candidate and there will be an actual fight come election day, November 4th, in New York City.
I actually want to come back to the new voters and the undecided voters later. I've read some of your work and especially your writings on Zohran Mamdani, and you've called him and his policies radical. Why do you say that? And what policies are you talking about?
Well, many of Mamdani's policies just run against the realities of New York City's financial situation, and economic law. Let's take freezer rent, for example. So 50% of rents of apartments in New York City are rent stabilized. And so a little side note here, I would say, one of the warnings that our framers have given us, if you read Federalist 10, is is factions of the majority 50 plus one due to economic reasons. And I think that we're seeing that right now, where you have 50% of New York City who live in a rent stabilized apartment. And so really Zoran only needs that 50 plus one in order to win the mayoralty. And yes, we believe in democratic values, but the reason why we have anti-democratic institutions within the United States is to safeguard against moments like these, where the passions of the moment, economic instability, a 50 plus one scenario, which will lead to, I would say, demagogic candidates winning in elections, whether it be local or national. But that's a side note. Rent stabilized apartments, they distort economic markets, particularly in New York City. In New York City, we've seen rent increases that are large in proportion to the rest of the nation and in proportion to other cities across the nation. And that's because of what happens when you have a rent ceiling on half of the market supply of apartments. It causes a pushover effect, a spillover demand effect on apartments that are not rent stabilized. Also, there's a welfare misallocation problem with rent stabilized apartments. Those rent stabilized apartments are not means tested, and so there are those who don't necessarily, who have been grandfathered in the system, who do not need the assistance, will not let go of the rent stabilized apartments because the alternative is very expensive market rate apartments in New York City. There's a problem of quality, landlord quality. When it comes to a lot of those who are the pro Mamdani test will say that landlords are taking in a large amount of profit when it comes to they're taking a large amount of profit, and because of that, they can do with rent stabilized apartments. But the reality is that when it comes to rent stabilized apartments, the amount of complaints when it comes to unfixed repairs, maintenance, etc., are higher compared to market rate apartments, because the reality is, despite what you want to believe about profits and evil landlords, is that when rent stabilized apartments, they restrict a landlord's ability to have maintenance, to maintain their apartments, to make repairs, etc., etc. And so that's just a fact. So between being grandfathered into the system, causing a spillover demand effect, and the worsening housing quality, while freezing the rent may sound good on paper, it will create devastating effects on the New York City rental market on the long-term curve. Another proposal that another major proposal of Mamdani's is fare free busing. The only problem with fare free busing is that the MTA is in a major deficit. We rely on federal funding a lot to make sure that our subway system and our buses continue to run. There's a lot of mismanagement going on in the MTA. We know that the MTA will lose $638 million a year if we decided to have fare free busing across the 5 boroughs in New York City. And so the problem is, okay, it's fare free busing, but is it really? Because the only way for the MTA to continue to operate the way it is, or like what me and many New Yorkers want the MTA to operate better improvements to the buses and subways and whatnot, is that it needs money. And so why are we incurring an almost $700 million loss in revenue for the MTA through busing when we need that money in order to improve transit infrastructure? And what many people suspect, what many New Yorkers suspect, and I'm definitely one of them, is that yes, it's free in the sense that you don't have to pay the fare when you swipe your Metro card, or now it's One Metro New York, when you tap your phone or open up Apple Pay to get into the bus or the subway. You're paying through higher taxes, right? And so it's really just a hidden fee that we're not seeing. And I believe that because we're gonna have to reorient our taxes in a separate way, there's going to be more cause for corruption and fund mismanagement within the Metropolitan Transit Authority. The third thing that I think is most alarming in Mamdani's proposals is city-owned grocery stores. And we don't need to look far in order to explain why city-owned grocery stores won't work in New York City. In Kansas experienced, in Kansas City in particular, they had extra COVID funds, and so they used it in order to create a municipal grocery store. Only a few months ago, that grocery store is facing millions and millions of dollars in losses. Less customers come in and buy from that grocery store, empty shelves and whatnot. Because the reality is, and we've seen this historically, and we have another example in Kansas now, that the city can't really operate grocery stores as well as somebody who that's their trade. That's what they do. And there's many of those people in New York City, whether they're bodega owners, supermarket chain owners, and a lot of those who are pro city-owned grocery stores will say that it's just a pilot program. But I submit to them, A, why are we wasting $60 million on a pilot program when we know historically what the result will be? And B, why are we putting the small grocery store owners, bodega owners in New York City out of business by undercutting competition? Because these city-owned grocery stores, according to Zohran Mamdani, won't have to pay for rent/mortgages in order to have those grocery stores operate. And so these are the questions. Once you look behind the hood, there's a lot of reason for consternation if these policies were implemented. There's a lot of reason for, I would say, uh, for critique. And ultimately, these policies sound good on paper, and they're hitting a pain point that a lot of New Yorkers feel. But simple math, and when you look at the economic realities and the financial situation of bureaucracies like the MTA, a lot of its proposals fall short of what they intend to do. And there's many more, by the way, like the $30 minimum wage, this lackluster education policy. It seems that those who support Mamdani doesn't they more support Mamdani because they're ideologically aligned, not because they believe in pragmatic politics for the ordinary New Yorker.
Right, Daniel. I agree that freebies, they sound good in the short term, but in the long term, they're a mess because A, someone has to pay for them, and B, most of the times it's the government, and that just basically means increasing debt. And whoever comes in next then has to sort out that mess. But I want to play devil's advocate here. And let's look at some of the other policies that were once considered radical. Let's say voting rights for women were once considered radical. Then we've got marriage equality. We've got free education in public schools. These were all once considered radical. Do you think there is possibly a way that Mamdani could pull it off? Because there have been a lot of policies that were once considered radical but are totally accepted and are considered normal now. Do you think that can happen? Or do you think, no, we New Yorkers are not going to believe the kind of mess that's going to happen with the socialist policies that Mamdani is promoting?
When it comes to marriage equality, voting rights, and other positions that were once considered radical, I think the operant difference is that, especially with the examples that you named, they are qualitative in the sense that they're qualitative and normative. They talk about what we want to value and aspire to as a nation. What is the nation's identity? When it comes to Mamdani's main proposals, we can measure them, we can test them against the economic reality, against economic laws and reality. And as I've talked about rent stabilization, when I talked about city-owned grocery stores, we can talk about a $30 minimum wage by 2030. In New York City, for your viewers who don't know this, New Yorkers aged from 16 to 21 years old, they tend to have a higher unemployment rate and a lower labor force participation rate compared to the rest of the country. When you look at the minimum wage in New York City, that question of why that is when these children, when these young New Yorkers live in a city like New York, the answer becomes simple, right? Many employers simply do not believe that, according to the market, that a teenager's labor, somebody who doesn't have experience, is worth $30 to do jobs that teenagers typically do, like work at a restaurant, work at a coffee shop, work in brick and mortar stores, in retail, for example. And so why are we doubling down and advocating for a $30 minimum wage? It's not that New Yorkers age 16 to 21 do not want jobs. We know that with the summer youth employment program, New York City has to expand it every year because more and more students want a job and they want that extra income and they want to start that first bridge into being a productive citizen, being a productive part of New York City's economy. But the minimum wage is a huge factor as to why many New York City youngsters, teenagers, and those who are just out of college aren't able to get jobs. Right? These are tested against economic realities. $30 minimum wage, city-owned grocery stores, rent stabilization. Right? We can compare New York City to Austin, Texas, for example. In the American South, particularly in Texas, there are stringent laws against market control. While there's a lot of pushes to build more and more housing. And so in Austin, there was a moment in time, only a few years ago, I believe it was in 2021, where prices in Austin were increasing rapidly. The city was getting more expensive. But compared to New York City, Austin has relieved some of its has released has relieved its housing costs compared to New York City because there are less market controls in Austin compared to New York City. And so that's the difference here. A lot of it can be tested. A lot of Mamdani's policies can be tested against economic reality, and so we just have to call it as it is.
Daniel, you're actually graduating very soon. I think you, if I remember correctly, you said May of 2026, you'll be out of Syracuse University and you're going to be in the job market, which is right now extremely demanding and it's not easy to get jobs. If I were you, I'd be very impressed by Zohran Mamdani because, well, he's talking about all the things that Gen Z have been complaining about. So many, well, according to reports, most of the Gen Z in the US feel that they'll never be able to own their own home in their lifetime. And inflation is really eating out of their pockets. So, how do you see this? Because housing prices have basically outpaced income growth in the US. And maybe that is one of the major reasons why Mamdani has become so popular with Gen Z. You're graduating soon. How come he doesn't entice you?
Again, you sort of answered your question within the question, which is really great. Mamdani, again, yes, he's very popular with young New Yorkers because he is, again, talking about a pain point that is affecting all New Yorkers, but particularly young New Yorkers, and young Americans in general. And I think that we're entering an era in American politics where populist populism, whether it be on the left or the right, is surging because, like you said, for many Americans, for many young Americans, the price of a home is now way too expensive, while the income that one can get is not enough to pay rent and to be independent. Not like our fathers and our grandfathers, grandparents and our grandparents. And so, the difference is I can separate somebody addressing the problem from whether the solutions that they're proposing to that problem will actually benefit me as a young New Yorker. Again, let's go back to the rent stabilization question. Much of those who live in rent stabilized apartments are often grandfathered in. Those who live in rent stabilized apartments, they have perpetual tenancy right. Perpetual tenancy rights, and they can, even if they play their cards right with leases, they can even extend that lease of that rent stabilized apartment to their children and grandchildren. If you're a young New Yorker, I grew up in the city, and so I have a place to live once I'm out of college and I'm looking for jobs in the city. But for many of those who are coming in from different parts of the country, from the Midwest, from the South, who want to move to New York City to achieve their dreams, and I'm flattered that you want to do so, how will freezing rent stabilized apartments, something that is a grandfather system, will allow you to find more inexpensive housing? Again, I've talked about spillover demand. When those young New Yorkers are young new New Yorkers, when they graduate college, come into New York City, like many of my friends who are seniors right now, they're going to look for those rent stabilized apartments because they're cheaper. Or let's presume Mamdani's mayor, they are frozen, but they won't be able to obtain one, right? Because it's become an informal black market when it comes to obtaining a rent stabilized apartment in New York City. And because there's such a demand, there will be such a demand for these rent stabilized apartments. Market rate apartments, they will increase because landlords and homeowners, they will need to find a way to make up for the lost revenue that they've lost because of market rent ceilings. And so that's just one example out of many that when I'm looking at Zohran Mamdani's proposal, and I think about my experience as a New Yorker, a lifetime New Yorker, I just find that, yes, he's addressing a real problem, but the solutions don't work, including $30 minimum wage. I really wanted to work when I was a high schooler. It's really hard to find work as a high schooler, again, because the minimum wage in New York City is higher compared to the rest of the nation. Many employers deem that it's just simply not worth it to hire somebody with no experience to perform a job that's not worth, let's say, I believe the minimum wage is around $16 an hour now in New York City. The reason why I found a job in high school is because I was lucky. This was towards the end of the pandemic when the economic markets were beginning to heat up. And so there were a lot of places that had walk-in interviews because they so desperately needed workers. My little brother, when he was in high school, was not so lucky, right? Because the market has cooled down, and so there was less of an incentive for workers again to hire somebody to hire a youngster with a higher minimum wage. And so when I reflect on my own experience, when I reflect on how hard it was for my little brother to find a job, how hard it was for me to find a job until the pandemic ended. When it comes to my knowledge of the rental market, I think every New Yorker who's been here for a while understands intuitively how the rental market works. When you talk about fare-free busing, for example, like for ordinary New Yorkers, they may not know that the MTA would lose $638 million a year if buses were fare-free, but they were students at one point. And you intuitively know if you're unable to give the student population of New York City fare-free busing or fare-free transit, how can you afford that for the entire city? These are the rational questions that one who's spent a while in New York City, who's grown up in New York City, or just lived there for a while, will come across. And then all you need to do is fill in the blanks by doing the proper research necessary.
Daniel, I want to end this conversation by touching upon undecided voters. Sure, Zohran Mamdani's policies might appeal to many because they're somewhat compassion driven, and on the other hand, you've got Andrew Cuomo, who's got the handling of the COVID pandemic, and that has, New Yorkers still have a very bitter memory and taste of how that went down. You're a New Yorker, and you're going to be voting. To all the undecided voters, can you tell them one thing that they should really care about in this election?
I think one underrated topic that we're not talking about enough in this election is education. And I think part of that has to do with the Disneyfication of New York City. I forget who coined the term, but I think it's a beautiful description of what's going on in New York City right now. The stable tax bases in New York City are families and the wealthy. Families are leaving New York City at a large rate. The wealthy, they can stay in New York City for a bit longer because their roots are settled in New York City, right? Because their children are in schools in New York City. If their lives weren't so rooted in the city, they will get up and leave as well because their money affords them the ability to not be so tied to one place. It's really just their children that has made them tied to New York City. Education is so important because if you want New York City families to stay and if you want the wealthy to stay, you need an education plan that will both serve the wealthy and the working class families in New York City. And Bloomberg's administration did a wonderful job of achieving this. They created and expanded gifted and talented programs. I don't know about created, but they were pro-gifted and talented programs which allowed those who are in upper middle class families to enroll their children into the New York City public school system, rooting them into New York City. And then with charter schools for lower income families, for majority Black and Hispanic families in lower income neighborhoods like Brownsville, Canarsie, East New York, and I'm naming Brooklyn neighborhoods because I'm from Brooklyn. They've allowed charter schools have given hope for those families. But yet, for some reason, Mamdani is opposed to charter schools and gifted and talented programs. And because he's opposed to both of them, there's a double bind issue. You're removing an education release valve for parents and working class families who want an education alternative for their children, thus uprooting them, giving them no longer a reason to stay in New York City because New York City is getting more expensive. And I can assure you, if Mamdani becomes mayor, New York City will become more expensive, not less, especially on the long-term curve. And with wealthier families, they see no reason to enroll their children into the New York City public school system. If they find no reason to root their children into the public school system or in the education system in New York City, they'll find themselves leaving to another state. And when we see New York City mediocre scores in the nation's report card, This is more called for consternation when keeping New York City families the stable tax base in New York City. I'm sorry, but Mamdani's core constituency isn't New York City families, even though he purports to represent them. When we look at the demographics of those who voted for him, particularly in the New York City primary, what we see in the polling that led up to the primary is college-educated younger voters who voted for Mamdani in droves because they're ideologically aligned. But working class families are a different constituency, and we see that it's the working class families when it comes to Asian families who are disgusted by Mamdani's anti-GT programs. When it comes to Black New Yorkers who voted heavily for Cuomo during the primary election, we see that there's a disconnect between Mamdani's real constituency, childless, young, college-educated New Yorkers, and the families, wealthy or working class, that have lived in New York City for a long time, whose families live here, who wants good education for their children. If education worsens over the next 4 years, you'll see an exodus in New York City that will continue to deteriorate the quality of life in the Big Apple.
Thank you, Daniel, for this candid conversation, and we'll surely keep tracking what happens, and maybe I'll have to call you back to Fair Observer and speak to us once the election is done. Maybe we can unpack what happens, and you can even talk about what you saw on election day and how the energy was. I think that'll make for a great conversation.
Yes, I would love to. Thank you so much for having me on.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.